Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen, I'm a managing editor here at Stratfor, and joining me today is Europe and economy analyst Mark Fleming-Williams to talk about the 200-year anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Now Mark, 200 years ago today, on a soggy battlefield in Belgium, the fate effectively of continental Europe for that time was decided. What really led up to the battle taking place? What did we see? What were the shaping conditions for Waterloo itself?
Our story starts in 1789. The French Revolution. The French people, France at that stage was the largest and most influential continental power at the time, rise up and execute their king. As a result of this and the French Revolution, this lets loose wave of emotions and a kind of maelstrom of action, which is seized upon by an enterprising corporal, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he leads French armies across Europe, defeating all comers, basically, defeating the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, in various battles from 1798 all the way through to Austerlitz in 1805. And so we get to the stage in 1810 where Napoleon has built himself an empire. He has spread France's boundaries further than they had been before, but he's also got these satellite states as well, which are under French influence. That brings us up to 1812, at which point he overreaches, decides, just like all European hegemon seems to do, to go after Moscow. And this proves ultimately to be his downfall, just like Hitler 150 years later, because they get to Moscow, the Grand Army gets to Moscow, runs out of food, and gets chased back to France. So that's 1814, was still a year before Waterloo. At this stage, Napoleon gets captured and put onto the island of Elba. But it's in 1815, the next year, that we see him leave Elba, land in France, arrive in Paris, relaunch, and it looks like, for a moment, Europe, having been peaceful after the 1814 victory over Napoleon, suddenly it's a massive scare. And the Napoleon is again marching at the front of an army towards Brussels. And the British and the Prussian army at that stage try to stop him.
And the man was nothing if not ambitious. And it's interesting because when we look at the battle itself, it's sad to say that there were bigger battles, both geographically and in terms of loss of life. And actually, if Napoleon had won at Waterloo, he eventually would have blunted himself possibly on a superior Russian army. So actually, although the stakes were high, eventually we think he probably would have lost, but he didn't, and that's key.
Indeed, he probably would have lost. I mean, he was trying to make the most of speed. He was trying to defeat each army as it came. So he defeated the Prussians 2 days before Waterloo. Then he was going to try and turn to beat the British at Waterloo, hopefully before the Prussians would arrive. And then his hope was, and he had made a career out of defeating European armies one by one. So but he then had still had the Russian and the Austrian armies to come. So he still had it against him, even if he beat the British.
And what he had going for him was he was a charismatic leader. He inspired his men who would fight to the death for him. And he was also an excellent military tactician. But then again, the problem he faced was he was facing Wellington, who had many of the same features. Plus, in addition, he had a really good defensive position. There was rain overnight, the troops were well rested, and actually Wellington established a defensive position on a ridge, which gave him good oversight of the battlefield itself, good fields of fire, lines of communication, and he established these really key 3 defensive garrisons around farm buildings that he could defend easily. And Napoleon, that's what he faced the morning of the battle.
In a way, there's some irony there, because Austerlitz, which is the battle I mentioned earlier, Napoleon won largely through knowing the terrain. He spotted the terrain, the battlefield, and he said, "This is a place I want to have a battle." Basically, Wellington had done the same thing at Waterloo. When he was facing an advancing French army, then he decided, "I know that terrain, and it's a good defensive position, and I know that I can defend that and hold out there."
And it was actually Napoleon's knowledge of the terrain that led him to perhaps not be as decisive as he was before, because he was concerned that given the soggy ground underfoot, if he committed his cavalry and his infantry, it would slow them down. So he actually wanted to wait to let the ground harden before he made his play. But that was a tricky move because at the time, the French had the numerically superior force, and really Wellington was banking on the Prussians coming to his aid, but they were tens of miles away.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's not just that. Sorry, as well on the muddy ground. Napoleon was all about the artillery. He was famous for hundreds of guns, and then you mass all your men together in one long column and then smash through the enemy. But the muddy ground actually also affected the way a cannonball bounces. If it's on dry ground, a cannonball will just bounce and bounce and just absolutely skip through the enemy troops. But in mud, it gets caught up. And so as a result, the French artillery was much less devastating than it was on other battlefields.
And it's interesting how we see these environmental factors have a part to play. And these things that now we kind of take for granted in warfare, fog of war, miscommunication, things like not being able to identify your own forces because of the colour of the uniform and at distance, misconstruing what troops you have. And it's a shame because we could spend a lot of time talking about the battle itself. But actually, let's move on. How did the battle what happened after? How did it shape the continent?
Well, Napoleon lost, of course. The Allies didn't make the same mistake twice. Instead of putting him on a Mediterranean island, they put him on a cold island in the middle of nowhere, where he only survived another 6 years. In terms of Europe, we actually had something called the Congress of Vienna, which was actually before Waterloo, because the Allies thought they were at peace at that stage. They thought they'd won. But the Congress of Vienna, which set the surroundings that defined Europe after Waterloo, created a new balance of power across the continent, where you had equal states, basically equal powers of states, meant that for the first time, almost in its history, European peace actually managed to last for, you had small squabbles, the Franco-Prussian War, the French might not call it small, but and the Crimean War. But actually from 1815 onwards, you had this peace which lasted all the way through, you could say, to the 1914 Great War.
And that's one of the big takeaways, is that actually when we look at the way that Europe has evolved as a continent, as a continental grouping, it hasn't been easy, it's been marred in conflict. But actually these sorts of battles have been necessary to bring about periods of de facto peace and shaped the future to come in Europe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The great beneficiary from this as well. Europe was a beneficiary in total, but I would say that the real winner out of this was the British. And the reason for that is that they had spent the last 400 years seeing the French everywhere they went in the world as they were trying to build their empire. They would always come across the French in India and in the United States. They'd fought countless battles. And Waterloo kind of ended that. So from 1815 onwards, the British are free, basically. The continent's at peace, and the British are free to focus on their global strategy of building an empire. And so as a result, we see the 19th century becoming the British century.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you so much. For more on the Battle of Waterloo and the way it shaped Europe itself, please read stratfor.com.